As history has shown, war can have great impact on the global economy. One of these periods in history came after World War II. In this presentation, we will review the causes and economic recovery policies that impacted the economy in 1945. During World War II, the United States government dramatically increased spending and the economy signaled the end of the Great Depression. The graph shown displays that dramatic increase in defense spending during the war and the direct correlation this had on increasing the nominal GDP of the country. When the government increased spending so drastically, investing in manufacturing, unemployment was also historically low. As the men went off to war employed by the government, women were left to replace them in the workforce, learning to weld, manufacture, and wait for their men to return. As people were working, the household income for many Americans increased and allowed for increased spending on commodities and normal goods. Further stimulation in the economy then occurred due to the multiplier effect. Then the war came to an end.
May of 1945 saw the lights go on again. Once more the nation's capital was blazing in all its glory, and in cities throughout the nation the blackout was ended. Germany had surrendered, the war in Europe was over. There was still a war to be fought to a finish in the Pacific, but that couldn't dim the celebration that marked the fall of Hitler and the end of his dreams of world conquest. 3 months later, crowds gathered in front of the White House, awaiting the announcement of Japan's surrender from President Harry S. Truman. It took 2 atomic bombs to bring Japan to her knees. But now Pearl Harbor was avenged, and the news triggered the greatest celebration the nation has ever known. In Chicago, tears of joy mingled with cheers as 1 million people sang and danced in the streets. In Seattle, it was wine, women, and song, mostly song as serviceman and civilian threw dignity aside. This was the time to whoop it up. The Japanese emperor may have a white horse, but so did this Seattle serviceman. The greatest and wildest celebration of them all was in New York's Times Square. Never before or since has there been a crowd like this on the Great White Way. 2 million people screamed their elation at the end of the most devastating war in recorded history. For 24 hours, the celebration went on, and not for a minute did it lag. Victory had come. Old Glory waved over a happy land.
When the war ended, unemployment was nearly non-existent and GDP was dramatically high due to the booming manufacturing industry. When the troops came home and demand fell for defense products, government spending decreased. People were laid off and GDP quickly decreased at a drastic rate. A combination of these factors caused the recession of 1945. Similar recessions have occurred after the conclusion of World War I, the War of 1812, and the Civil War. In 1945, nominal GDP decreased by over 12%. This recession was relatively short, only 8 months, as the United States transitioned from wartime economy to peacetime production. One of the reasons for the relative short time of this recession was that there was significant demand remaining and money available to spend, since unemployment barely rose after the war. However, transition was still needed for the manufacturing industry as they reverted to the production of goods that were not defense-related. The vast amount of troops coming home was a potential problem for the economy. Thus, the government stepped in to make sure this did not hinder the economy from bouncing back. As victory was celebrated on September 2, 1945, when Japan surrendered and World War II came to a halt, the federal government was making plans to welcome home the troops and keep our economy stable. Although Congress was still on summer break, President Harry Truman called an emergency meeting of Congress to discuss and establish domestic monetary policies on September 6, 1945. The 8 guiding principles set forward by President Truman to set the stage for post-war transition are shown here. In addition to the reconversion guiding principles, the following policies, both international and domestic, also played a role in the economic recession and stabilization. We will take a deeper look into both of these influences in the following slides. The primary monetary policies on international recovery during this time period were those that came out of the Bretton Woods Institute meeting in July of 1944, and the continued support of European stabilization within the European Recovery Program that extended U.S. supports to Europe in 1947. Another key monetary policy that was implemented domestically was the result of our engagement in World War II was the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. This act became affectionately known as the GI Bill. Let's examine these further. As World War II raged on, economists around the globe began to consider how the world would recover from this devastating conflict after the war. Monetary policy developments led by John Keynes of the British Treasury and Harry White of the U.S. Treasury began to take form. 44 other countries joined in these discussions and agreed to the establishment of two key global institutions. These were the International Monetary Fund, which was established to assist in the stabilization of currency and to provide short-term loans, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development that would provide reconstruction and development loans to countries post-World War II. As Britain's global power began to decline and the United States began to increase during this time frame, great discussions ensued over which currency should be noted as the gold standard. Of interest, the dollar was accepted as the standard. Unfortunately, negotiations over the final drafts of monetary policies that came from the Bretton Woods Institute had detrimental health impacts on both Keynes and White. Both he and White gave their heart and soul to establishing these monumental economic policies, and both died within 4 years of signing the act. Although the Bretton Woods Institute laid solid support for global economic recovery, Europe's recovery continued to struggle in the years that followed the surrender of Japan. In 1947, George Marshall, the United States Secretary of State, recognized our reliance on Europe's economic recovery and our dependence on these trade relationships and supported the European Recovery Program. This program extended $13 billion to European states devastated by World War II to allow them to rebuild and resume their current level of prosperity. Of interest, the program was extended. However, Russia did not accept the aid granted as they did not want the U.S. to have economic governance of any sort over their country's economy. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944 was a domestic monetary policy. Following Keynesian economics, large sums of money were pumped into the U.S. economy to support the return of servicemen. This aid focused on the transition of the enlisted troops to civilians and provided funds for education, housing, business, development, and medical services for these returning veterans. The bill was known as the GI Bill, and its success was so profound that it is still in existence today, supporting the return of veterans of foreign wars. As the end of the war brought recession, as the economy shifted from wartime production back into the production of civilian goods, Congress passed the Employment Act of 1946 as a bill that would provide full employment. A major function of this bill was the establishment of the Council of Economic Advisors. This council was given responsibility to focus on microeconomic issues, while the Federal Reserve was slated with the macroeconomic issues. The Council of Economic Advisors made 5 technical advances in policymaking, as shown here. The goal of this bill was full employment, full production, and stable prices. The National Labor Relations Act, or Wagner Act, is a bill that was passed allowing unions to gain strength among workers. This bill established guidelines to promote collective bargaining as well as provided rules that employers had to follow. This bill is responsible for the growth the unions experienced during this time period. Many employees during this time were still fearful from the Depression and were looking to something that could provide some guarantee. Unions seemed to fill this void by offering strength in numbers. The Taft-Hartley Act sought to limit some of the excess power that had been given to the labor unions in the National Labor Relations Act. This amendment provided a list of prohibited actions that the unions could not partake in, whereas the original bill only contained prohibited actions by the employers. This amendment also prohibited certain types of strikes. Right-to-work laws were created by this amendment, allowing states to pass right-to-work laws, closing union shops, and providing a means for employees to work without having to join a labor union. Finally, this amendment provided a means whereby the federal government could seek an injunction to cease a strike if it endangered the national health or safety. This bill, although vetoed by Truman, gained enough support to overrule his veto. As a country, we still feel the impact of these economic policies today, many decades later, as we fight with collective bargaining in the state of Wisconsin and as our troops struggle to re-enter civilian life after coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. Government leaders may be dissimilar and wars may be in different locations, but the economics of war look alike no matter the decade.